not only, so to unpack that, by 2050, it could be nearly 70%.
What happens in the Arctic does not stay.
Russians have painted the colors of the Russian flag.
Greenland is the world's largest island and ocean in terms of trade and security, and its value is
security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
Greenland was never supposed to be part of this conversation. A frozen island, a NATO territory, quiet, distant, forgotten. And yet, here we are. After Venezuela, the world crossed a line it pretended still existed. Leaders removed, borders bent, rules replaced by leverage. What once sounded absurd now sounds possible. Because this is no longer a world governed by agreements, it's governed by power. Greenland sits at the center of melting ice, critical minerals, Arctic choke points, and unfinished Cold War ambitions. And when the strongest country on Earth decides the old order no longer works, distance doesn't matter. Alliances don't protect you. This isn't about Greenland. It's about what happens when the unthinkable becomes policy. Venezuela marked the moment the old rules quietly stopped applying, not through a declaration, not through war, but through action that proved something far more destabilizing. Sovereignty now has conditions. For decades, the international system rested on a simple assumption. Borders were fixed, leaders were protected by law, and power was constrained by norms. That assumption collapsed when force, financial leverage, and jurisdiction were fused into a single tool. No invasion, no occupation, just results. The message was unmistakable. If you control the courts, the currency, the banking rails, and the pressure points, geography becomes irrelevant. This wasn't about ideology, it was about capability. The United States demonstrated it could reach across continents, override domestic authority, and reassert dominance without firing a shot. In a world carrying over $315 trillion in global debt, where sanctions move faster than armies and financial access determines survival, power no longer needs permission. It needs leverage. That shift matters because once precedent is set, restraint disappears. Legal frameworks don't collapse all at once. They hollow out. Each exception rewrites what's acceptable. Each unique case becomes a template. And suddenly the question is no longer, can this be done, but why not do it again? This is how escalation begins. Not with chaos, but with normalization. When rules bend without consequence, every strategically valuable place gets reevaluated. Energy routes, trade choke points, resource vaults, security buffers, which is why the conversation doesn't stop in South America. Once the world accepts that power overrides principle, attention moves naturally to assets that matter more, last longer, and reshape the balance of the future. And that's where the Arctic enters the frame. Once attention shifts north, Greenland stops looking distant and starts looking inevitable. The idea that it was ever unthinkable rests on a misunderstanding of history. Greenland was never ignored. It was deferred. The United States has treated the island as strategic infrastructure for nearly a century. During the Cold War, American military installations turned Greenland into an early warning shield against Soviet missiles. That logic never expired. It simply went quiet. Today, the U.S. still operates a permanent base there with unrestricted access to airspace, ports, and intelligence corridors stretching across the Arctic. In practical terms, control already exists, just without ownership. What makes Greenland uniquely exposed is its political structure. It is not fully sovereign. It is semi-autonomous, economically dependent, and lightly defended. Denmark provides governance, but not power projection. Greenland provides territory, but not security. That imbalance matters in a world where strategic value outpaces administrative control. Geography compounds the issue. Greenland sits astride the shortest routes between North America, Europe, and Russia. As Arctic ice retreats, those routes are no longer theoretical. They are becoming commercially and militarily viable. Control of the island means influence over future shipping lanes worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, as well as surveillance dominance across the North Atlantic. Then there's scale. Greenland is the largest island on Earth, yet home to barely 56,000 people spread across a landmass larger than Mexico. That ratio, vast territory, minimal population, changes the calculus of power. It lowers resistance, simplifies logistics, and reframes control as management rather than conquest. So Greenland was never unthinkable. It was simply waiting for a moment when leverage mattered more than appearances. And once power begins evaluating assets instead of alliances, size, location, and utility take precedence over tradition, which raises the next question. If Greenland's value is geographic, the Arctic's value is far greater. Once geography becomes the focus, the Arctic stops being a frontier and starts being high ground. This is where the future balance of power quietly tilts. For most of modern history, ice made the Arctic irrelevant. That constraint is disappearing. Summer ice coverage has declined by more than 40% since 1980, opening maritime corridors that cut thousands of miles off traditional trade routes. What once took weeks through the Suez can now move through the polar north in days. That time compression translates into lower shipping costs, faster military deployment, and strategic surprise. Control of the Arctic is no longer symbolic. It determines who monitors, who intercepts, and who moves first. The region now hosts advanced radar systems, submarine patrol routes, satellite ground stations, and missile defense infrastructure. From this altitude, surveillance stretches across North America, Europe, and Eurasia simultaneously. No other region offers that reach. This explains the acceleration. Russia has rebuilt and expanded more than 400 Arctic military installations since the early 2000s, restoring Cold War-era bases and deploying hypersonic-capable systems along its northern coast. China, despite having no Arctic territory, has declared itself a near-Arctic state, investing billions into polar research stations, icebreakers, and dual-use infrastructure under the banner of a polar Silk Road. The Arctic is becoming a crowded battlefield without battles. Every port, airstrip, and undersea cable now carries strategic weight. And as ice retreats further, competition doesn't slow. It compounds. Shipping lanes, fiber routes, energy corridors, and military staging areas converge in the same narrow space. This is where Greenland's position shifts from important to decisive. Sitting between North America and Eurasia, it anchors the entire northern corridor. Whoever influences Greenland doesn't just observe the Arctic, they shape it. And once the Arctic becomes essential, the conversation inevitably turns to what lies beneath its surface. Once the Arctic becomes essential, what lies beneath it becomes unavoidable. Ice was never just ice. It was a lock, and that lock is breaking. Under Greenland's thinning ice sheets sits one of the largest untapped mineral concentrations on Earth. Geological surveys estimate the island contains 43 of the 50 critical minerals designated vital by the United States for national and economic security. These aren't optional resources, they are the building blocks of modern power. Rare earths for missiles and radar, lithium and cobalt for batteries, graphite for energy storage, and specialty metals for AI hardware, satellites, and advanced weapon systems. Right now, control of those supply chains is dangerously concentrated. China processes roughly 70% of the world's rare earths and dominates refining capacity even where extraction happens elsewhere. That imbalance is not theoretical. It directly affects military readiness, grid resilience, and technological independence. Every sanctions package, every export restriction, every supply disruption reinforces the same vulnerability. Greenland changes that equation. Not tomorrow, but structurally. As ice retreat accelerates, extraction costs fall and feasibility rises. What was once locked under kilometers of ice becomes economically reachable. Analysts estimate Arctic mineral development could represent hundreds of billions of dollars in long-term strategic value, not through short-term profit, but through supply chain control. This is why security language intensifies when resources enter the picture. Minerals don't just fuel economies, they determine who builds the future. Whoever controls them controls pricing, access, and leverage. In a world shifting toward electrification, automation, and militarized technology, resource independence becomes national survival. So while Greenland is framed as a security concern, the deeper driver is permanence. Military threats change, trade routes shift, but mineral dominance compounds over decades. And once resources define the stakes, alliances are no longer about protection. They become obstacles. Once resources define the stakes, alliances face a stress test they were never designed to survive. This is where NATO's structure collides with reality. NATO exists to deter external aggression. Its credibility rests on Article 5, the promise that an attack on one member triggers a collective response. But that promise assumes a clear adversary. It breaks down when pressure comes from the alliance's center of gravity itself. The framework offers no mechanism for restraint, no enforcement against internal dominance. Power inside the alliance is asymmetrical by design. The United States accounts for roughly 70% of total NATO defense spending, exceeding $860 billion annually. That imbalance isn't symbolic. It dictates outcomes. Militarily, diplomatically, economically, the alliance depends on Washington. That dependency creates a paradox. The actor NATO relies on most is also the one NATO cannot realistically confront. Denmark's sovereignty is legally absolute but operationally thin. NATO membership provides protection against outsiders, not leverage against allies. If security guarantees remain intact, walking away becomes irrational. And if those guarantees are questioned, the cost of resistance skyrockets. This is why escalation doesn't look like tanks crossing borders. It looks like pressure applied where rules are weakest. The alliance's dilemma isn't whether it can respond, it's whether it can afford to. A fracture inside NATO would destabilize European security overnight, disrupt defense planning, and expose a continent already reliant on U.S. logistics, intelligence, and deterrence. This turns collective defense into a bargaining chip rather than a shield. When protection becomes conditional, solidarity becomes negotiable. When alliances become leverage, force becomes optional. This is where power operates most efficiently, without uniforms, without invasions, without a single missile launched. Modern dominance doesn't arrive through tanks. It arrives through contracts, budgets, and dependencies. Control is established by offering security in exchange for authority, funding in exchange for compliance, access in exchange for alignment. It is quieter, faster, and far harder to reverse. This is the non-military playbook, and it works because it doesn't look like conquest. Greenland already relies heavily on external funding. Public finances are constrained, infrastructure costs are high, and economic diversification is limited. Strategic investment measured in single-digit billions of dollars, trivial at the scale of U.S. defense spending, can reshape decision-making permanently. When defense guarantees, intelligence sharing, and development capital are bundled together, sovereignty becomes negotiable without ever being surrendered on paper. Legal frameworks allow this. Autonomy arrangements create channels to bypass central governments. Defense cooperation agreements can be expanded quietly. Oversight shifts incrementally. What begins as support evolves into operational control. No vote, no referendum, just normalization. This method avoids backlash. There's no trigger for collective defense, no invasion to condemn, no headline moment to resist. Influence grows through memorandums, joint commands, and budget lines buried in technical language. By the time the shift becomes visible, reversing it would require confrontation, something smaller actors cannot afford. This is why pressure rarely announces itself. It embeds, it integrates, it waits until alternatives disappear. And once control is established without conflict, the final obstacle isn't military resistance. It's whether anyone else is willing or able to push back at all. Once control is exercised quietly, resistance depends on leverage. And this is where Europe's position collapses under its own constraints. Europe's power looks formidable on paper. An economy exceeding $18 trillion, a market of 450 million people, a regulatory reach that shapes global standards. But strategic power isn't measured in GDP. It's measured in independence. And Europe lacks it where it matters most: security, energy, and defense logistics. European militaries remain structurally dependent on U.S. capabilities: satellite intelligence, missile defense, airlift, refueling, and nuclear deterrence. More than 75% of NATO's high-end military enablers are American-controlled. That imbalance limits escalation options before they even exist. Any response that risks U.S. disengagement carries costs Europe cannot absorb. Economic retaliation offers little relief. A trade confrontation would expose European vulnerabilities faster than American ones. The U.S. remains Europe's largest export destination, accounting for over 500 billion euros annually. Financial markets are dollar-centered. Energy contracts are dollar-priced. Sanctions without U.S. participation lose bite. Legal appeals sound strong but land weak. International law has no enforcement arm without power behind it. Statements invoking sovereignty and territorial integrity create moral clarity, but not deterrence. Europe understands this, which is why responses stay cautious, calibrated, and deliberately vague. This isn't hesitation, it's arithmetic. Europe's leaders aren't choosing silence, they're managing exposure. Every step too far risks destabilizing the very security architecture they still rely on, which leaves a final reality. When opposition lacks leverage, outcomes aren't negotiated, they're accepted. And once acceptance becomes the default, the system quietly rewrites itself. When acceptance replaces resistance, the transformation is complete. This is no longer about Greenland, minerals, or alliances. It's about the operating system of the world itself. The post-World War II order was built on predictability. Borders were fixed, power was constrained by rules, and legitimacy came from institutions. That system only worked because the strongest actors chose restraint. What we are witnessing now is not collapse, but replacement. A shift toward a model where outcomes are decided by leverage, not consensus, and where legality follows power instead of limiting it. In this environment, territory is no longer taken through conquest. It is absorbed through influence. Resources are no longer traded freely. They are secured. Security guarantees are no longer permanent. They are conditional. The cost of maintaining this system is staggering. Global military spending now exceeds $2.4 trillion annually, but the cost of losing position is far higher. Decline in this world is not gradual. It is sudden. Greenland represents a test case, not because it is unique, but because it is clean. Low population, high strategic value, minimal resistance. If power can be exercised there without consequence, the precedent hardens. And once hardened, it doesn't stay isolated. It spreads, quietly, efficiently, and irreversibly. This is how eras end, not with war, but with silence, recalculation, and the realization that the rules everyone depended on no longer exist.